Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. Democracy has often been presented as an ideal, where citizens can participate and benefit from a fair society. But as we face growing inequality, political turmoil and loss of faith in modern life, the price of preserving democracy might be proving too steep. Join journalist Masha Gessen, historian Paul Ham and academic David Runciman in the 2024 session Democracy is Not Worth Dying For, chaired by journalist Geraldine Doogue.
Well, hello everyone. Geraldine Doogue is my name, and I'm delighted to be with you on this Sunday morning for this, what I think will be a marvellous discussion. It may not leave us feeling thoroughly settled to discuss our topic, but it'll be very much worth it. Is democracy really worth dying for? I don't know that we'll feel the serenity, to use the Castle's little cliche, but posing the question seems very appropriate right now, I must say, though I really do wonder, after all the dramas of the year with the last few months, particularly with the US election, but others, of course, being this big year of elections, but even the last week might be encouraging some of us to revisit many of our nostrums. We are either to reinvigorate them or to indulge in further torpor. I'm not sure. That's what I will get back from you when we open to questions. I also noticed our own ex-PM Paul Keating quoted yesterday suggesting a fundamental boredom at the base of our culture that was, quotes, culturally exhausted, the culture, with nihilism and an attendant loss of faith characterising modern life, leaving us with no guiding light. So why would you defend that particular vacuum if he's right? And that's what we'll wrestle with our wonderful panel for the next hour. Though I do think that after Michelle Obama's speech, we were talking about this in the green room, I'll take days to calm down from that. So certainly it's left me with a sort of invigoration that I wasn't quite expecting. Now I'm going to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes in conversation, then I'll throw it open to you. And I would like you to greet Masha Gessen, David Runciman and Paul Ham. Please welcome them. And Masha is now an opinion columnist at the New York Times, widely followed, I think, probably by a lot of us. Their book, Surviving Autocracy, has been really helpful thinking about this. I realise I haven't brought my books with me, but never mind, we'll cope. David Runciman was Professor of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University and was one of the key voices on Talking Politics, which I think kick-started my fascination with podcasts, actually, David, which rather now dominate my life. But his latest pod has really got me in past, present and future, very innovative, and we might get to that. But for the purposes of today, his book, How Democracy Ends, is very pertinent. And Paul Ham hails from Sydney, though is now pretty well based in Paris, where he teaches narrative history at Sciences Po. He's widely published, and I know a lot of us here will probably have read a range of his books. I might add, I was really pleased, David, to hear, Paul, that your book, Hiroshima Nagasaki, has been made into a 6-part series, which is, I suppose, ahead of the big anniversary next year. So that's fantastic.
It won't make it for that next year. But
it won't make it, won't it?
One day.
Oh, yeah, I see. It's like that. Right, okay,
couple of years.
Right, okay. Now, so it is a big question. Is democracy really worth dying for? I wonder, in a way, whether democracy, we might even realise that democracy needed to be died for, whether it needed to be defended. And that's where I'm going to start with David. Would we even realise that it needed defence, David? I mean, do we see where it's going wrong, or are we locked into old patterns where we're waiting to see sort of tanks on the streets before we actually think, oh my God, there's a danger here?
Yeah, I think part of the problem here is we have a really clear historical template, both of the heroic struggles for democracy, where people did Many people did think it was worth sacrificing their lives for the great emancipation struggles, liberation struggles, enfranchisement struggles. And we also have a clear historical template of the threats to democracy. Tanks on the streets, martial law, generals on TV telling you that this normal programming has been suspended, civil war. And we spend our time, because we have won, we think, those emancipation struggles, looking for signs of the old threats. Naming no names, is this politician going to turn out to be Hitler or whatever it is? And it's very unlikely that history will repeat itself. This is not the 1930s. This is nothing like the 1930s in the mature democracies. I'm talking about here the kinds of societies like this one, like the one I come from, the United Kingdom. We are elderly societies, we are prosperous societies, we are used to peace, we are network societies, we are educated societies. We have all sorts of challenges that we face, but we could spend our time waiting for that general to come on TV and tell us that the real threat to democracy has arrived, while our democracies stagger on, stumble on, get stuck, spin the wheels. We fight the elections over and over again, waiting for the thing to turn up. I think the bigger danger to us is not so much that those old threats are coming back, but we could spend a decade or two waiting to be told that the crisis has arrived, while our democracies just thin out. They just get weaker. I think it's going to end with a whimper, not with a bang.
And just to get you a little, so what is the most important threat at the moment? Maybe I'll just get you to isolate that before I go to Masha.
I think the biggest threat in a way is that our democracies are quite tired. We rely on a range of institutions to keep them functioning, but we don't reform or change those institutions. We just keep going through the motions. And we're trying to squeeze a really challenging future through a set of institutions that have been around in the mature democracies, well, in some of them for a couple of 100 years or 100 years or 50 years. We don't change the way we do it. We just keep swapping the people in and out in the hope we'll find one that knows how to make this thing work. So it's more like a kind of frozen quality, I think, that we're facing, rather than the familiar collapses that get people to the barricades. I don't think being told your democracy is stuck in the mud is going to get you to the barricades.
Now, Masha, you also have written about the fact that there are the sort of monsters of the past, the known monsters of the past, the Stalins of this world. And even in Russia, your home country, where people say, well, look, we don't like it, but they're not Stalin. Putin's not Stalin or others. Now, are you echoing really what David is saying there?
Actually, I would disagree. I think that to people who lived under Stalin, Stalin wasn't Stalin. And to a lot of Germans under Hitler, Hitler wasn't so bad. There's not just Germans. There's this little item from the New York Times that makes the rounds of social media every couple of years, where some New York Times writer had set out to debunk unfounded fears of Hitler, and to convince readers of the New York Times that his anti-Semitism was all rhetoric. So I think we actually, as humans, never perceive threats, with some remarkable exceptions. And it should be said here, I think, that there is a place where people are dying for democracy right now, at least one, and that's Ukraine. In fact, a country that was actively in the process of inventing itself as a democracy, that was inventing a politics of the future, and that was attacked with tanks and bombs by a country that insisted that politics is in the past. So people are dying for democracy, but we rarely do have that clear a view of the threat.
So you don't have the clear. Are you in the same? Do you think it's tired, such that it's seriously tired? And of course, you live in the US now, which gives you a particular perspective, I'd suggest.
So part of the problem for me with this question is that I'm not sure what we mean when we say democracy. Right? So when we talk about Ukraine, for example, it's very clear to me what Ukrainians mean when they say democracy. It's not the lived conditions of their present day, where they're actually living under martial law and have been for 2.5 years. It's a dream. And I think democracy is always a dream. Right? And I think a question that we have to ask is how are we getting any closer to the dream in our current political situation, or are we retreating? And I think in the United States, certainly under Trump, we're retreating hugely. But I think that retreat has been in process for most of the last half century, at least.
Right, and I was saying to you earlier that Nick Bryant, a BBC writer, has written about precisely this, that really if you go back to the Founding Fathers, they were very ambivalent about the people, and that was a very regulated, a very carefully chosen set of words about the right to vote.
Right, that's not actually what I'm referring to, but I think that's a very good point. And democracy is a dream of the rule of the poor, the government of the governed. We're never going to achieve that dream. I think it's a point well taken that the Founding Fathers were not really committed to that dream. And they created a set of institutions that have made it very difficult for the United States to achieve that dream. And American reluctance to reform those institutions, even to question those institutions, and in fact, a growing movement toward originalism, and that I think sort of crosses party lines in ways that we don't necessarily always perceive. That it has been a huge part of that retreat from the dream.
Now, Paul, how do you see this? I'm going to come to one of you because I think your work on the making of the Führer of Hitler is really extremely helpful to me in this. You've also written The Soul recently, A History of the Human Mind, but I found the formation of this young man totally fascinating. But before I ask you in detail, how would you respond to what you've heard?
I think the biggest threats to democracy are complacency, corruption, and bribery, and ignorance. And I think the problem with democracy, from my point of view, looking historically over the last few hundred years, is that it's been a victim of its success rather than its failures. It's been almost too successful in the 20th century. It started off in 1900 with no democracies, as we understand the term. The most democratic nation at that time, which would shock you, I think, in the late 19th century, was Germany. And it had extended suffrage to all men and had developed the prototype of a welfare state to represent the workers. We had no democracies. Australia and New Zealand around that time had extended the vote to white women. That was it. Now, it may be a dream, but there are real-world consequences which are wrapped up in a democracy, such as universal suffrage, such as equality before the law, such as freedom of speech and expression, the freedom to worship as we please. And I think the complacency about those as a given is crippling us, is really quite insidious. We should cherish those values, which we do have in this country and in many other democracies. There was a huge rush to become democracies in the second half of the 20th century. It went from about 38 to 120 countries were either democracies or aspiring democracies. This was the great flood tide of democracy, as we understand the rule of the people, by the people, the vote, each person, one vote. This was but it wasn't simply about, and I think one of the problems we're getting at is not so much democracy as a process, which is a working process. It is the will of the people. That's very important, the word will. We have to keep working at it. But the problem has been in the last 50 years is the disjunct between democracy as one point and economic justice. And the democracies have let us down, not per se because they're democracies, but because they weren't enacting the right policies. We were being hoodwinked into believing in a policy which has let many people down. The supply-side economics of the last 50 years has not worked for most people. And we've seen a divide between the rich and the poor as we've never seen since before 1914. And that, to me, is the real crisis we face.
So it's between distribution and growth that has not panned out.
It's not delivered.
Not delivered.
Not democracy is delivering in its essentials, but it's not delivering in the policies. We're being, and we see this in Britain, we've seen this in America in the times, hoodwinking the public into believing in an idea which is not delivered. Are you leaning forward because you want to say something, David?
Maybe. You go.
I'm reading the body language. No, go on, answer, and then I'll come back to something.
So I think, one of the things that it is really important to remember is this is a short story, right? 100 years, in many places 50 years. And you can take two views about that, and we might differ on this. So one view is that we're really in the early stages of this thing, actually. So maybe there's some complacency in there, but also there's a lot we could still do, and if we think this is the limit of democracy, we're kidding ourselves. That would be the optimistic view. I think the pessimistic view is it's just a general rule that things that haven't been around for a long time won't last for a long time. Something that's been around for 50 years might have another 50 years of life left in it. Very unlikely that we're at the beginning of a very long story. If you encounter something, you're usually in the middle of the story. So if we're in the middle of this story, and it only started really after the Second World War, and in many places more recently than that, we're maybe talking a few more decades until it really does shift into a very, very different mode. And for me, the challenge here is that we still think we've just got to keep doing it the same way. That's the really vital thing. And squeeze it through elections. Now, I'm really keen on elections. I think democracy without elections is a terrible idea and it doesn't work. But we pin so much on elections, we are so fixated on the election, getting someone new in as the means by which we will reinvigorate this thing, rather than thinking about the 100 other things that could be called democracies, different ways of citizens being involved, different kinds of decision making, different ways of organizing political parties, political information, political financing. But we just think it's either this person or this person, and please God, my person wins this time. Every election is the most important election ever. Every election is the election on which everything hangs until the next one. We're squeezing it through a very, very narrow funnel.
So Churchill's line, it's better than anything, than the alternative.
But this thing that we call democracy is the thin version of it. And if you look a long way back to the ancient world, or if you look around the world, or if you look locally, if you look internationally, if you pitch it into a future of AI and technology, it's very unlikely that the American presidential system is going to be the way in which you think you should decide the future. And yet we are absolutely at the moment stuck in this narrow window where all people want to know is who's going to win the next election. That is too thin a version of democracy.
Okay, now you can all take this on notice, because I want to come back. I said to our guests, I want to make it introspective where possible, rather than just diagnosing someone else's democracy. To think about that thing, is democracy really worth dying for? I heard J.D. Vance on just during this week, something else I listened to this week, saying, when all's said and done, the only thing I would sacrifice my life for is my child, which was a sort of a moment of great honesty. And I thought, yes, right, one has to think about this. I was struck by your analysis of Hitler. Hitler, as a young man, was most certainly prepared to risk his life for his nationality. I mean, was it a nation there? And he was utterly devoted, viscerally devoted to this idea. And of course, the crushing loss in World War I was something that motivated him to think anew. But, do you think from your looking at Hitler, I mean, what was it that motivated, that level of motivation, I'm ready to die for this, which I think he was ready to. He didn't die, but I mean, was he ready to? Can you see that abroad at all? Could that be tapped now?
He was recklessly brave in World War I and was awarded the Iron Cross twice. We won't go down that track, but yes, he was willing to give everything for Greater Germany, but also the German race. We can't take race out of the equation there. He was already, in his mind, this extraordinary idea of social Darwinism, that the fittest will prevail.
So
and the pan-Germanic idea was that not just the survival of the fittest, but the fittest will actually dominate the earth. So that was germinating in his mind. He was early 25 or so during World War I, and but in terms of Ukraine, I can just give you a quick personal anecdote. When I first saw Putin's tanks rolling into Ukraine, I was so revolted that this could happen, the invasion of a sovereign, well, not sovereign country, but a country that wanted self-determination, that I lunged for my computer and looked up voluntary jobs for elderly blokes driving trucks or packing. And my girlfriend led me away from my computer and sat me down with a stiff gin and tonic and said, you're not going to war, there's no more war for you, that's it. I think that the question about dying for one's beliefs, you also have to ask the alternative question, which is implicit in it: would you kill for your beliefs? And dying for democracy means going to war for democracy or defending democracy. And I'm struck often by this definition of democracy, which is what it's not, in spite of it's not fascism, it's not Nazism, or it's not communism. What is it? We have to, I think, find a definition which galvanizes us, because it is dearly worth preserving. And the complacency is a function of its success. That, it's a bit like the Monty Python sketches. You know, what has democracy ever done for me? You know, well, the vote. Oh, yeah, everyone's got the vote. Equality before the law. Well, look at Donald Trump. He's immune from prosecution. What has democracy ever done for me? Well, imagine Scott Morrison or Donald Trump in power for the next 40 years. Maybe that will galvanise the people.
You never know. Galvanises them.
God forbid.
And Masha, you warn it. Well, you don't even know whether you think democracy is definable enough to decide it's worth dying for. Is that a fair comment?
I'm sorry, there's a weird
yes,
knocking.
Yes, it was a strange noise there.
Strange knocking.
I think you wonder whether democracy is even an entity you understand sufficiently to consider whether you'd throw your life away for it. Is that a fair comment?
Well, I don't know that you need to understand something sufficiently to throw your life away for it. I was just pointing out that it's a very difficult question to answer when I don't know what we're asking. But I think words that I thought I'd never say, but I'm sort of with J.D. Vance on the only people I'd sacrifice my life for are my children, the only phenomenon. But I certainly know a lot of people who are risking their lives in Ukraine right now.
But in Russia too. I mean, I think we've just all been...
Russia.
Vladimir Karamurza, who was just released recently in that exchange with Evan Gershkovich, I mean, and Navalny, I find it extremely hard to process their thinking as a safe Australian. Do you understand it anymore as a Russian-born person?
I am familiar with it. I have known people. I know Vladimir Karamurza, I know Ilya Yashin, I know other people who are in prison in Russia right now. I knew Navalny. I come from a different school of thought. I was raised in and around dissident circles in Russia, where there was a very strong belief, actually, that you don't die.
You don't die.
You don't die. If you're threatened with prison and you have the option of leaving the country, leave the country. Nothing is worth dying for, and you will be more useful alive than dead. That is a peacetime paradigm. That's something you can say to a totalitarian regime. Is, I'm not engaging with you on these life and death terms. I'm going to go into exile and try to do something from there, as little as that may be. In a wartime situation, you don't have that luxury.
So Navalny's whole approach is so you're aware of it, but there were very different temperamental styles, were there, or sensibilities in Russia? Because I find that very interesting.
I think that there are different perceptions of time. I think that when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, we believed that the Soviet Union was going to last forever.
Right.
I think Navalny thought that he had a fighting chance of outliving Putinism, and that he was hoping to outlive in prison. I think that's also true of Karamurza and Yashin. They consciously stayed in Russia knowing that they would be imprisoned, in the hopes that even if their chances were much worse than 50-50, that they might still be alive in prison when Putin dies.
Do you admire that, or do you think it's folly?
Of course I admire it. I don't aspire to it, but I admire it.
It's sort of crazy brave. It's just staggering, I think.
Yes. Can I just ask, was it ever considered that that Navalny would set up a government in exile, and as a strong, powerful symbolic gesture, rather than just serve himself up on a platter. I mean,
everyone who knew and loved him tried to convince him to stay outside the country. So Navalny, as most of you probably remember, was poisoned in August 2020 and was airlifted to Germany and went through rehabilitation in Germany and then decided to go back to Russia in January 21, knowing that he would be imprisoned.
Yeah, exactly.
And his wife, his family, his friends, his colleagues were all trying to keep him from going back.
Karamurza allegedly wants to go back too, although he's been warned that he's got about a year to live if he goes back. I mean, I wonder what will happen there.
Well, look, what happened with that prisoner exchange is that people they were simultaneously given their freedom and sent into exile. Both, I mean, there were several people who had no idea they were going to be imprisoned, such as Evan Gershkovich, but also several of the Russian political prisoners. But people like Ilya Yashin and people like Vladimir Karamurza, they had the option of leaving. They didn't leave. They consciously continued their political activities up until they were imprisoned. Karamurza was sentenced to 25 years for high treason. And Yashin even tried not to consent to the prisoner exchange. So their life's work is taken away from them when they're sent into enforced exile.
In fact, you've also warned us, Masha, in your book about the inadequacy of language in the face of rapid change and deterioration of rules. Now, and you've experienced that quite clearly in the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia. Now, why does that exercise you?
Well, we don't have a way of doing politics if we don't have a language for doing politics. We can't, we may not be able to agree on what democracy is, but we probably agree on many things at the outset. But when language is degraded, as it was in Russia under the totalitarian regime, and it is again now, or as it was by Donald Trump during his presidency in the United States, we lose the only tools we have for creating politics.
I mean, you quote him, I've just forgotten the man's name, who, seeing this, as you did, decided to think of words like the mafia state to describe what was actually underway under Putin, fundamentally shifting the nature, well, in theory, of people looking on. I thought that was a fascinating way of thinking about it.
Right, so the person you're referring to is this Hungarian sociologist and political scientist named Balint Magyar, who's done absolutely remarkable work on thinking about autocracy over the last 20, 25 years now. And his initial argument was that when he was looking at Hungary, when he was looking at Russia, under Viktor Orban and under Vladimir Putin, we were using the language of Western liberal democracies, which is problematic enough when we apply it to Western liberal democracies, but it's hugely problematic when you apply it to a country that is just emerging from an era of totalitarianism, because in those particular situations, all you could talk about were the things that weren't there, right? There wasn't freedom of speech. There weren't free and fair elections. But that doesn't help you define the thing itself. You have to find some positive language to define the thing itself. As he was saying, you're trying to describe an elephant and you say the elephant can't swim, or the elephant can't climb trees. But what does that tell you about the elephant?
So, in other words, in trying to establish, and I think this goes to David's point, in trying to reform it or establish new areas, we're very good at defining what it's not, but are we good at saying what it could be? I mean, that, in a way, is what you're implying. You've got to be more specific about what's possible and where it's drifting.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's even worse than that. We're not very good at describing what the thing is. And part of why we're not very good at defining what the thing is because it's baked into Western cultures, right? I spent quite a bit of time in Surviving Autocracy on talking about the sort of jam that political media found themselves in. What were they supposed to do to describe Trump if the words that they had for doing their work were words that normalized and legitimized him? They didn't have other words. They used words like policy or diplomacy to describe what he was doing, but it wasn't policy and it wasn't diplomacy, and so words like policy and diplomacy became degraded. It's not inevitable. You can always find ways, but you can't be that inventive on a daily basis. Some degree of normalization happens, and that degrades the language.
David, does that ring true to you? Is that part of the drift that where one doesn't see the dangers?
Yeah, and we, by definition, we use the language of the past to describe the present, and it's inadequate for the future. And it's very hard to find the language that might describe a future that we haven't got yet. So we try and frame it in the terms that we have, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, but it does create the problem of normalization for sure. And there is an opportunity here for imaginative, creative politicians, not to come up with a whole new language, a revolutionary language, but to stretch it. But it has to be forward-looking. I mean, our democracies are just very unlikely to be like they were 20 years ago in 20 years' time, in all sorts of different ways, because the world is not going to be like it was 20 years ago in 20 years' time. I mean, I think the most bizarre feature of our way of doing politics is that someone from 40 years ago seeing our world now would be staggered by it, the changes, particularly the changes in the way that we consume information, the way we interact with each other, the human experience of love and relationships and education. This is like a sci-fi movie for someone 40 years ago, except the politics is exactly the same, right? It's completely familiar. I mean, in Britain, elections sometimes feel like they could have been fought 100 years ago. Same party, same electoral system, same unreformed House of Lords. They were promising to reform it in 1918, and here we are. Haven't quite got around to it yet. So it seems like there's a mismatch here between the pace of change, the possibilities, the experimentalism of our lives. We lead such experimental lives now with these machines in our pockets. We're trying all sorts of crazy stuff. Yeah. And our politics has shrunk to a narrower and narrower space. We've got to open it up. It doesn't mean we have to die for it, but we've got to open it up.
Just before I go to Paul, I did hear I was saying on Ezra Klein's podcast, his editor said, "Now Ezra, we're going to change the conversation. I want to go back to the Paleolithic era, June 24. Another very laugh out loud moment. Paul.
I'm just wondering whether a lot of this critique is about the mechanics of the system rather than the principle of the system. And yes, we can argue about how democracy works and should work all day, but I think we have, surely, where there's no whataboutism here, democracy as we conceive of it is probably, and I agree with in your book, you say it's not just the Churchillian worst possible system except for all the rest. It's the best possible system in worse situations. Yeah. And I can fully subscribe to that. There's no prophet of democracy. There's a prophet of communism, there's a prophet of fascism, there's a prophet of other systems, but there's no demagogue or ideologue who's saying democracy will lead to the promised land or the dictatorship of the proletariat or to the master race ruling the world. And thank goodness there's no prophet of democracy. The frustrating thing is we recycle our leaders every few years. And for many people who are particularly of a religious disposition feel that's very frustrating. Where is this continuity? Well, the beautiful thing is it's not a negative aspect of democracy. I think the re-electing our leaders is an incredibly rejuvenating process. It injects new blood into the system. You only have to look at Britain at the end of 14 years of Conservative rule to see the sclerotic, corrupt and divisive government that was in power and had to be thrown out, and we have new blood. Whether that new energy is for good or bad we wait to see. But the voter will have the choice in a few years' time. And that, to my mind, modestly speaking, is a beautiful thing. I think we lunge for absolutes and perfections and utopias where it's a muddle through process. And that may not be satisfying for many of us, hankering after some sort of... But if we've got other things in our lives, love, friendship, family, we can make do with democracy, I think, as it stands, with obviously as a work in progress, with endless refinements that can be made.
Yes, in fact, it's interesting because you also, I think, Masha, you quote fabulous material from Václav Havel, the former leader of the Czech Republic, who, of course, had absolutely suffered as a dissident for many, many years. And he has this wonderful set of lines about the fact that the person who does raise their voice, especially in autocratic times, dreaming of something better, doing all these things that David is talking about, is often regarded as an eccentric, a complete eccentric. And by the people who have learned to cope one way or the other, as you say, people under Stalin learned to cope, they just say, oh, for goodness sake, shut up, get on with it. Now, I just wonder whether people are prepared, if they're not prepared to die for it, are they prepared to be so eccentrically regarded that they will speak up and offer very different models of democracy?
Well, that is a perennial problem, that we adjust. We have an almost infinite ability to habituate to whatever circumstances we're thrown into. And then people who object to those circumstances, people who, one of my favorite examples of the last decade probably is Greta Thunberg, a teenager who has an autism diagnosis, which I think has a lot to do with why she is just incapable of normalizing things that make no sense. But she is like the quintessential dissident, because when things don't make sense. I was actually one of the first journalists to interview her when she was in the first month of her school strike. And she explained to me what had happened to her. She said, they were teaching us about climate change, and they were telling us that, all the things that are true of climate change. And I thought, if that is true, then it's an emergency, but no one is acting like it's an emergency. And so she started insisting, by the means available to her as then a 15-year-old child, she started insisting on acting like it's an emergency. But I think that's what Havel was referring to, right? Anybody who starts acting like it's an emergency, or like things that are normalized should not be normal, is viewed as a threat to the fabric of society.
David, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I think one of the things we should remember about our democracies is that they're not the heroic version, right? There are heroic versions. The ancient Greek version was the heroic version. The job of the citizen was to fight and die for it. Ours were partly designed to liberate us from politics. Now, we have this class of people, this eccentric class of people called politicians. They're not like us. Partly because they're really interested in it, and most of us aren't. Most of us have got better things to do with our time. And the luxury of our democracies is that we are allowed that. You can tune in and tune out. And a lot of people, I know this in the UK, a lot of people have complained that what's been so difficult about the post-Brexit years is it's been really hard to get away from politics. and I understand this, right? It's a real challenge to us. So these questions about how and we're going to step up, it does require a kind of mindset. Representative democracy, the basic principle is someone else does it for you, and then you judge whether you're happy with it, whether you care, can you even be bothered to take a view about this? And even in democratic societies like the UK, maybe like Australia, there is a division in the populace between what are now called the activists, or the people who are so interested in politics they'll actually do it without being required to do it, and, to be frank, the majority who won't. And that is a big divide, and one that also skillful politicians have got to work out how to bridge. So it's not like the democracies that we have were designed to galvanize us. They were slightly designed to insulate us from these challenges. And if we are facing, that's why the Greta Thunberg example is such a great example. She was behaving like someone who hadn't internalized that message. Like, she internalized the message, which was, if something really bad is about to happen, surely that is a problem for all of us, not just for the... And what's so striking about that is how rare it is. Almost to the point that it requires someone who is not neurotypical, someone who is atypical, to see it. That is a challenge for our democracies, and it's a challenge for all of us. And I speak for myself here. I mean, my job is to study politics, and I quite like doing other things.
Like literature. Of course, in Australia, I mean, I was just talking on our podcast, Global Roaming, to Rory Stewart about this. We require people to vote.
You do.
Well, they've got to turn up, and they get fined $25 if they don't. But yes, it's a compulsory voting, and it's a very regulated democracy. And therefore, we fight it out in the centre. And gee whiz, I reckon that does protect. It does insist that people take a certain amount of engagement, but I like that because I believe that it forces the bulk of the talents of the country to take part in this whole process. Does that offend you as somebody who wants to...
It doesn't offend me, but I don't think compulsory voting is the answer because it's still squeezing it through the narrow funnel of the elections. Voting is, being required to vote every few years is a burden. It's not a huge burden.
So what would you do instead of the election?
Well, but you could open it up. I mean, there are 100 different ways that citizens could have an input into the way their lives are lived, locally, nationally, consulted in different ways. I still remember the dream of the internet revolution, which it was going to be transformative for democracy. It turns out it's been great for autocracy. But part of the reason for that is we really haven't tried it yet. We really haven't tried the democratic potential of a technology that does put the power in the hands of citizens to express themselves, not just I prefer this person to this person every few years, but this matters to me now, I'm willing to do this, I'm willing to step up, I'm willing to be involved. We haven't done that yet. This is more to the point that there's a long, the more optimistic view, there's an opening up of this. But it's almost like this was just gonna, this technology was just gonna make us all better citizens and better democrats without us having to do anything. It turns out the people who were incentivized to use the technology to improve their political prospects were the autocrats.
Yeah.
And democratic citizens were not incentivized.
I was going to actually say this for the end, but you noted recently that Yuval Harari, the Israeli historian, said, quotes, "The digital revolution marked the true end of history because it spelled the end of human agency as the primary determinant of social history," which is a very Yuval comment,
yes,
but it's a very depressing comment. Do you agree? Do you agree with that?
If artificial intelligence is as intelligent as everyone tells me it is, then it would choose democracy. It would preserve what works best for most people most of the time, rather than suddenly become a demagogue and obliterate us.
I hope you're right. Yes. Now, I want to get to another thing that Masha points out is don't think that institutions will protect you, you've said. Now, I found that particularly challenging because I've sort of taken the Timothy Snyder, the American thinker's advice and invitation, invest in your institutions because they will save you. Now, why do you say it so powerfully?
Actually, there's no contradiction between what I say and what Tim says. And we've been in conversation about it all along. I wrote that piece when the night that Donald Trump was elected. And it was a direct response to this very smug attitude on the part of many Americans that, well, yes, he was a rogue actor, but our institutions are so strong. And my point was, well, actually, they're not. American institutions in particular, as then most people learned over the next 4 years, many of them are rooted in culture, are not enshrined in any kind of law. Entire structures, such as the ethics structure of the executive branch, there's no law that created it. It was just a kind of tradition.
It's convention. So
it was convention, and Trump was able to get rid of it basically at will. But there's another point that I was making, which is that institutions are generally designed with good faith actors in mind. You get an actor like Donald Trump, and there's no institution that can stand up to him.
They did in that first term.
No, they didn't. No.
You don't think? You don't?
No. Like what?
Well, Department of Justice. I mean, and Millie was. I mean, I think that they were ready. The military was poised. I think that personally, I think they would have stood up.
Well, I mean, the military was poised, and yet his.
I hate to say that. I mean, it's a ghastly thing to say,
but yet his supporters were able to take over the Capitol and disrupt the vote count and kill a number of law enforcement officers. I don't think the military was particularly well poised. It was certainly taking its sweet time. No, the institutions absolutely failed to protect themselves and us.
David, I remember actually, I did an interview with you for Saturday Extra about 5 or 6 years ago, and maybe it was when your book did come out, and you said something which I've never forgotten. You actually said, if I think I'm remembering, yes, I hope I think this is right, that in fact, this was in the early years of Trump, that you felt that a lot of people did believe in their bones that the institutions would protect them, which is why they were prepared to take the risk of doing something as dramatic as vote for a
I think they did. I think it's part of the complacency.
And that this underlay a lot of attitudes, and I thought that was very perceptive.
Yeah, I've changed my mind in the sense that I was writing about Trump 1.0. You know, fool me once, fool me twice is a useful motto in life. I find the re-election of Donald Trump a completely different prospect than the election of Donald Trump, because first time around, there hadn't been anything like it. He's a bit of a clown. No one really knew. I mean, I also think there's a really interesting counterfactual here, which is, absent COVID, he would have been re-elected.
Yep.
And he would, I think, have been, I mean, I don't know what would happen. People differ about this, but if history is a guide, he would have been a lame duck quite quickly. And it's a very interesting question where American politics would have been now.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that?
Well, second-term presidents, he didn't, they didn't stop him, and they certainly didn't stop him when, having lost, he tried to say he hadn't lost. But he didn't achieve much, and his most significant achievements were pretty conventional ones, the Supreme Court and so on. So a second Trump term, plus he would have been less angry. A lot of it is driven by his gut instincts here. And if he'd been re-elected, I suspect the Trump era would have been a weird era in American politics. And now it's a really interesting question, where would we be? Where would the Republican Party be? That 4-year interlude and the prospect of him coming back, that terrifies me in a way that first time round didn't. Partly because people would be re-electing him with all the knowledge that they have, and partly because he and the people around him have had 4 years to prepare. He wasn't prepared first time. He didn't think he was going to win, right?
Right.
So we're in a very different world. So if we had that conversation 5-6 years ago, I think I was complacent at that point, because I thought that people thought the institution would protect them, and then they voted him out. And they would have learned from that. But, to go back to the point I said earlier, most of us don't spend much time thinking about politics. We vote every few years, and then we just revisit the questions afresh again. Democracies are not great at learning even relatively recent lessons. It's all fresh and new. So I'm much less sanguine than when I said that to you.
Okay. Now, I've just actually looked at the time, and so I'm going to throw it open to questions now. We've only got 13 minutes, but and please don't make statements if you wouldn't mind. If you actually could ask a question, I'd be very grateful. I think we'll have mics either way, and I might take 3 on the go, just so we can get, yes, over there. Hang on a tick. Have we got the mics there yet? I suppose yes, here they are coming now. Can you come over there, please, if you don't mind? Thanks very much. And yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you to the panel. It was really interesting. My question is to all of you. After the brief period at the end of the last century that Francis Fukuyama called the end of history, it seems that democracies around the world are now retreating, while autocracies and tyrannies seem to spread their power over all of us. What do you think are the 3 main factors for that? Because hopefully if we understand the main factors, maybe we can fight it better.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to ask if you can ask a question too, and then I'll put 3 of them to... Yes, go ahead.
Is it the way... the internet and democracy. We were talking about the internet and how it was going to maybe save democracy, and actually it's being used against democracy. Is it the way the internet is used to either improve or corrode democracy that must be looked at? X/Twitter is owned by a would-be oligarch supporting a would-be autocrat. How do we make these digital town squares more democratic?
Good, very nice. And one more, I'll go over here.
Hi, I'm a high school history teacher, and I'm navigating some pretty tricky times in my classroom. So my question to you, the experts, is what is one historical topic all high school students must study to be prepared to be engaged as citizens of democracies?
Wonderful questions, right. Okay. Now, I'm going to go to David for that one historical topic that you would like.
Oh, really? I wanted to answer the internet question. Unless someone else.
Sorry.
I think it's, so I was talking about this last night when I was proposing lowering the voting age to 6 at this. And I have a lot of sympathy with that question, but we do put a lot of demands on kids to kind of learn the lesson. And I would ask the question, what should all of us, learn, think about? And I think one of the things that we should learn about, I haven't got one topic, but we should learn, to go back to what we were saying, is how relatively recent this story is. Not to sort of eternalize it, democracy is this grand thing. It's our story, it's a recent story, it's our parents' and grandparents' generation. It doesn't go back much before that. It belongs to us, it's ours. You get a sense of the freshness of it, the relative, how recent some of the big advances are, and to create a sense of possibility. If I could sort of relate that briefly, we had a 3-by-3 question, which would take but just to connect those two questions, why autocracy, and one of the things that I think people misunderstood about the digital revolution is that doing politics online is hard work. Informing yourself, finding out, the idea that it would open up this world of information to us, and it's a question of incentives, right? Autocrats are really strongly incentivized to find out about us. And we're not that strongly incentivized to find out about them. It takes a lot to ask a citizen to trawl through the online records of their local council to work out who's doing a good job, who's doing a bad job. And then on top of that, you've got the fact that the main corporate institutions that govern this thing are the least democratic organizations in the world. They are genuine autocracies. They often belong to the founders. The rules of Meta mean that Mark Zuckerberg can never be outvoted by the board. Imagine a state. We would know what we would call that state. Dictatorship seems too mild a word for it. So in order to liberate that democratic potential, we have to recognize that it is both hard work and put more power in the hands of citizens, but also recognize that a boring subject, which is corporate governance and corporate regulation, is really key. No one got elected promising a platform of corporate governance, but my God, these corporations are powerful, and my God, the only people who can regulate them are democratically elected politicians. Indeed. So we should elect ones that want to do it.
Indeed. There was just a gorgeous, before I go to Paul, Christopher Clark, who's an Australian who was also a professor of history. Is he at Cambridge, or is he at Cambridge? And he was, I heard him on the rest of my podcast listening, The Rest is History, saying that he was taught at school here in Sydney that the history teacher said, boys, we're about to do the 1848 revolutions. They were big and they failed. But we're going to look at them anyway. It was that sort of, such a crucial moment in the development of democratic thought. But that was the honest introduction to boys who I don't suppose were really, I can remember 1848 thinking this is so dull, and of course now I realise how incredibly important they were. You were responding.
I was struck by the mention of governance. I used to run in the early 90s the most boring newsletter in the world called Governance. And it was trying to hold executives to account for their outrageous bonuses and share options. But that's an aside. To the first question about Francis Fukuyama, I think that was certainly more than a grain of truth in his essay, however idealistic it might be referred to these days. But it identified, at least, not that this was the end of history, but this system, this idea, the will of the people expressing itself in a political form, was to be sought after, to be desired, and to be wished for. It was also, and he construed it as the end point in history. We can't improve upon this, but of course we can improve upon it. And yes, there's been a regression in the last 2 decades. I think we're around about 73 democracies now, if the Hoover Institution is correct, in Stanford University. But democracies come in waves. We've seen it after World War II. There was a rush to become democracy because there was great enthusiasm. To the point about a moment in history that I would choose, and I would choose Japan's history. I've studied this quite extensively, and a country with an extraordinary history of feudalism, then dictatorship, a military dictatorship with terrifying consequences in the Pacific War, to then acknowledge that the warlord we should be emulating was MacArthur, and to change the system into a democracy which I think we'd all accept had fairly encouraging results in its very young history. As to the IT revolution, these echo chambers are perpetuating autocratic or conspiracy theories, lies, plain stupidity. We all know this. What needs to be done, as Theodore Roosevelt did, was to break up the monopolies, to break up the IT companies, which he did with the railroads. It can be done. Democracy gives us that will to meddle and to change the world.
And Masha, the 3 factors, or what factors particularly contribute, do you think, to the decline?
Let me just note that I actually, 2 of the 3 questions were posed in the form of 3 factors, or the one thing, which I find a little disturbing in sort of the way, the reductive ways that we have of thinking. I don't know that there are 3 factors, and I certainly don't think there's one thing that you should be studying in history. But I think that we have to understand that autocrats and aspiring autocrats succeed because they're addressing very real anxieties. They're actually talking to people who feel uncertain, who feel dislocated. We are living through a period of mass dislocation, mass displacement, what Hannah Arendt called when she was writing about the 1930s, how homelessness on an unprecedented scale, rootlessness on an unprecedented depth. We are living through a time like that, and a time like that lends itself to autocratic leaders. We know this, and we have a pretty good idea of how that works. I think that the way to counter that is not by thinking, and this is where I would disagree with Paul, is not by thinking about democracy as a sort of way of muddling through, which I think is a very technocratic way of thinking about democracy as a sort of system of management. But democracy can be visionary. And we can see democratic leaders who say, the future can be better than the present. Right now, we just have autocrats saying the past was better than the present, and I can magically transport you there. We're not seeing a lot of democratic leaders saying, actually, you could wake up in this country in 5, 10, 25 years and feel better than you do now.
Right, thank you. Now, can we have one quick question here, and then I'll thank you.
China.
Yeah.
Tell us about how China is going to play out with democracies like Australia's.
Who wants to tackle that? Incidentally, I did hear, just speaking of your Japan, that there's more antipathy towards China. I mean, you might say yes, of course, with Japan, but it was a very interesting thing I just heard this morning about the Japanese, quite significant numbers of Japanese wanting to align themselves with the Filipinos in rebutting the behaviour in the South China Sea, and they're very close to China. It was just a very interesting insight into how Japan is also shifting very considerably at the moment, because they've not been at all prepared to say something like that before.
No, it's a slow process of revelation. China is a perfect example of why we should cherish democratic principles. You see, it's a classic example of what we should not be doing. This is an autocracy with capitalistic elements, which is many claim to be working, and I see it as very, very insidious, especially the idea of how the internet is being used in China. I don't know if you've studied this, but this extraordinary paper recently, which I've used in my recent book on the soul, which is about the separation, the Cartesian almost separation of mind and body, the digi-self and the flesh, the bio-self, and they have no real connection anymore in parts of China, where the digi-self is is the interface with the government, with corporations, with your life, and the bio-self just sits there back at home and enacts the rules being dictated to it by the state through the digi-self. It seems to me the first instance of the complete denial of free will to the individual, and or at least in the early stages of. And that, when you mentioned China, I think it's a terrifying prospect. I don't have an answer of how we deal with it, what our place is really in relation to China. You speak to corporate bosses, they applaud China because there's a huge market open up for them without any real ethical or moral engagement with the consequences of the Chinese system.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there because I'm looking at the clock. Look, I don't know whether we did answer the question, is democracy really worth dying for? But I hope you agree it's been a fascinating conversation. Would you please thank Masha Gessen, David Runciman and Paul Howe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.